Today we're going to be discussing feminism. And to me, feminism really arises, right, in the turmoil of the 60s and 70s, where you see a lot of what we call identity thinking coming into play. This is the time of the civil rights movement. There's a lot of, turmoil on the ground. There's the Vietnam War. So a lot of questions are being asked about, like, who are we? How are we going to identify ourselves? How do we think about ourselves? And again, I think a lot of identity art sort of arises in this era, where we were talking about specific identity art in relationship to like race and ethnicity in another lecture. But I wanted to talk to you about the idea of using gender as identity as well. And some people say, well, why are we not talking about like, manism or something like that? And, the way that our culture, our society in the Western world has been organized, men have been the predominant leaders of that society. It's a patriarchy. And so again, there isn't really a reason to right try to have a category, let's say, related to the imaging of men. It's much more relevant, might we say, to consider how women try to think about their gender, right, and how that informs their decisions, their imaging of themselves, right. And when I study feminism, I think of it kind of through two different categories, and these are my labels, that I've made up through my study of feminism. So if you look in a book, you may not see it discussed the same way, but I always say there's two camps. There's the essentialist camp, and that's a camp that is driven by the idea of the biological. You have a vagina, you have the reproductive organs of a woman, right? You have breasts, right? So you are feminine, right? Obviously, today we know that this is sort of a very limited way to consider, gender. This is a camp that emerges first and is really thinking about like how being a woman, right, informs your art making, right, your identity practice. I'd say today it's considered the more limiting of the camps, right, and not a lot of essentialist feminists are practicing anymore because again they think it's not really how you should think about or craft a discussion of feminism. If you study feminism, there's what we call multiple waves of feminism. We're now thought to be in the third wave, right, of feminism. So we start out with the first wave, which is very essentialist, and then we move sort of into the second wave, which is what I call constructivist. It's a feminism that starts to think about how do we create the image of woman, right? Is the idea of sex secondary, right? Gender as being an illusion, gender as being a construction. How do we put on the trappings, right, of the feminine, let's say? And again, if you think about the idea of transgenderism and such in today's conversations, I'd say the idea of constructivism was needed because it's about this idea of how do you put on an identity or can you create an identity. And it's not really all that new if you go back and look at Marcel Duchamp in his work with like this the persona of Eros c'est la vie. His question with Eros to me was about, are we what we are biologically determined to be, or are we what we decide to be? And that's the important question. The third wave of feminism happening today, I think it's about questioning what roles women can have. um where like feminism in the past was more about like get out there and work and like women, take your power for yourself. And I think now today feminism is about what are the multiple roles that women can play, like a mother, a housewife can be viewed as just as relevant, right, as the CEO, right, or the lawyer. So I think today's feminism is about like the varieties of roles women can play and be proud of, and how not to just have it be about one type of woman, let's say. So it's interesting how the conversation has changed from the 60s to today. And it's a very deep conversation that obviously, you should look further into because I can't say much more than that in the scope of our time together. So go do some research if you're interested in the waves of feminism. It's very interesting. So we're going to look first at the essentialist camp or the biology driven camp. This is the earliest camp, as I mentioned, and it really focused on the idea that the woman's body defined expression, the imagery could be used in a sort of powerful way. Now, when I talk about essentialism, I always start you off with Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago. So, Judy Chicago, right? That wasn't her given name. Her name was actually Judy Gershowitz. And she changed her name to Chicago, her city of origin, because she said she didn't even want a name that was linked to the patriarchy. I'm Jen Robinson, right? And I get my name from my father, right? Vic Robinson. So my name, if you think about it, is linked to the male in my family, my father, right? So it's a patriarchal system of naming. What Judy Chicago is trying to do with this is reject that idea of the patriarchal name and take a new name for herself. It may seem extreme, but it's about making a point about naming. And if you think about how naming for women has changed over the years, I was born in '76, and so I've seen how the naming issue has changed. When I grew up, everyone had their father's name. There was no sort of idea of anyone not. And typically, the mother had taken the father's name as well, right? So in my family, my mother was originally Michelle Piggin, but she married my father and she became Michelle Robinson. I was born, I became Jen Robinson. Um, so as I went on through the years, I noticed that a lot of women then went to hyphenating, right? So they would get married and they would have became, let's say, Michelle, Piggin Robinson. And then today for me, when I got married, I was like, why do I need to change my name at all? And I'm not intending to have children, so it's not an issue of the confusion of who do these kids belong to, right? Or anything like that. So when I got married, I didn't change my name, so I just kept my maiden name, as they would say. So the idea of naming, again, it's been a road of thinking about it patriarchally, and then what does it mean to design your own identity, perhaps. For me, I didn't understand why I needed to change my name. I've always been this person. I don't want to become a new person in a sense. So, but again, somebody else might say, well, I want to be of my husband's family. So women think about this in very different ways. Or some people would like to have a hyphenate, Jen Robinson Miller. My husband is a Miller. So, you know, um, but again, there's sort of this flexibility. I think that's emerged, and Chicago was like, I don't even want to think about that sort of static idea of naming. I want to take on my own name or my own identity. When Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro met, they met at California State at Fresno. And they were struck by the fact that there wasn't a lot of leaning in their classes towards feminism or discussion of feminism. So they took it upon themselves to start what we call the feminist art program in 1972. And they said through this program, they wanted to create course material and experiences, right, that were linked to feminist ideals. One of the first famous projects they did was called Woman House. And what they did for Woman House is a very unique idea. They bought a house in the suburbs of Los Angeles, a kind of rundown, kind of condemned kind of place. So it was cheap. And they set about renovating it, making it, you know, inhabitable again. And then what they wanted to do with the space, they said, was use it for performance art, right? And art installations. So just have it be like a place that women could gather. So I find this interesting. They bought the house and then through the labor of the people in the program, they renovated it. If you think about construction, it's usually considered a very male dominated discipline of work. I've had two houses built from scratch, and I'm going to tell you, on site watching my houses be built, I never once saw a woman doing anything like swinging a hammer, laying tile, painting a wall, nothing. I never saw a woman until the final clean, right before we were given possession, where they come through and they clean everything to make sure, there's no dust and construction dirt. That's the only time I ever saw a woman. So I think even the project and how they were renovating the house was meant to say, how do you rethink women's work, let's say? Then they used the house, like I said, as a performance space and an installation space. And they were famous for doing different rooms that correlated with different feminist issues. So you have the menstruation bathroom and the nutrient kitchen. The menstruation bathroom, I'm sure I don't need to tell you much about it, but what they were trying to do, they said, with this is that they said the idea of menstruation, bleeding monthly, something that's linked to our reproduction as women, they said, if you think about it, it's a very hidden thing. When women are in school, they're sort of pulled out to go to the health day where, the boys don't come, and you learn all about this. And the idea that, like people keep tampons and pads very secret, in their bag. You don't want anybody to see these things. They said it's sort of, why is it not something we're just much more public about? Why is it, couched in these sort of terms that don't make any sense? They say even if you look at like tampon commercials, they'll use that blue liquid to show you how absorbent a tampon is. They're like, what? Why is that being censored that way? Like, let's all be grown-ups, right? Women bleed. So they were trying to be kind of in your face with messaging. And I find essentialist feminism is very in your face. It does not care about offending you. It doesn't care if you're like squeamish or you're like, oh my God, I'm seeing a tampon. They'd be like, oh, get over it, right? So they're very in your face. The nutrient kitchen, I love the shapes on the walls. They can be read as breasts or fried eggs, you know. So but I always think they're trying to say, like, what women do in the home, and that the mother's role is to cook, to clean, right? That's the traditional mother role, let's say, the traditional role of the kitchen. And they were questioning that value of women in the kitchen making stuff for their family. Now, today, if you think about it, you know, this is a very old way of thinking what they're presenting, but it had to be challenged. I think it allows for what we see today, which is division of gender labor in the kitchen, division in cleaning. I always joke that I don't clean my house. My husband does. He was in the military. He loves to clean. He's very neat. And I'm just like, oh God, I hate cleaning. Oh, this is a chore. I hate it. Gender roles don't hold fast any longer. But I think, back then, coming out of the 50s and the 60s, they're like, well, what is this sort of idea of the perfect woman, in the kitchen cooking for her family? And maybe we need to think about that. This is another piece from Woman House. It doesn't have a formal title. Where you have a woman kind of emerging from a linen closet. And I always thought this piece was somewhat again about the idea of invisible labor that, moms kind of do this stuff behind the scenes. I remember my mother, even though she worked, she always did all the laundry, she did all the cooking. It's stuff that happened kind of beyond my notice a bit. And when I had to go leave and go off on my own, I'm like, "Oh, this is a lot of work to, like, wash your towels and cook your food, and thanks, mom." I never noticed this invisible labor, as they call it. And then in class one time, we were talking about this piece, and someone said, "Well, what if it's this idea about women, in the 40s and 50s and 60s who were gay, were lesbians, and they did not feel comfortable being out, and so they would often marry and, have children and be in a family, because they felt that they couldn't have a different lifestyle." And they were like, "What if this is a piece about sort of coming out of the closet?" And I was like, "Oh, wow, I never would have thought about it." And that's why when I have classes with discussion, the possibility for discussion, it's so illuminating because, even though I'm very much an ally within, the idea of the LGBTQ community myself, I had just never thought about that perspective because as a straight woman, I just hadn't. This idea of being in the closet, perhaps, especially in more traditional family times, right? I was like, wow, that's really, really poignant to think about. And this is a performance from Woman House. I think, the picture and the title kind of says it all. A lot of people think feminism doesn't have any humor, especially essentialist feminism. And I'm like, no, I have to disagree. Sometimes you could tell they were being serious, but they were having a lot of fun too. So let's look at Judy Chicago on her own, and probably her most famous piece was The Dinner Party, where she created what she called an alternative to the Last Supper, in a sense. So go back and look at Leonardo's Last Supper. She said, "I wanted to create a dinner party populated with women, right? Important women, both mythological and historical." So if you look at the women who were part of the dinner party, she says, "I used both mythology, right, and historical women as well." Um, this piece, when it was made, was considered really a landmark, right, of feminist art. And unfortunately, it was so big that for many, many years, it was just in storage. It wasn't on display until the Brooklyn Museum of Art decided to create the Sackler Feminist Art Institute, and they created a space just for the dinner party. And now it is on display. It is beautiful. I love the shape of the room it's in. It's kind of this triangular shaped room with this sort of hidden purple lighting. It really is a very, and you'll notice the door frames you come in and out are triangular. So it's just a really great space. What did she do here? She said she wanted to create these dinner settings for these very, very prominent women, and she said, "I wanted to think about how you could use what they would call traditional women's crafts as a basis." So she said things like ceramic making and ceramic painting, embroidery. Right? She said if you look at these arts, they're more so considered crafts, and they're considered kind of lower art forms. She said I wanted to elevate these types of art making because they're usually things that were done by women. So, and she even made the piece collectively. She brought in women who were known for ceramics, known for embroidery. She brought these crafters in, and they all worked collaboratively together to make the piece. So we've talked a lot about how it's someone's idea, right? But you have these other people to help you construct it. She actually gets a little bit of criticism for this because they many people say it shouldn't be a piece just credited to Judy Chicago. It should be a piece that's credited to all the artists who worked on it. So when when you title it, it should be all the names of the women in alphabetical order, which would be super confusing, right? But it would speak to the values she said she was practicing. So she gets a little bit of, crap for this, we might say. And again, if we look at the women seated here, know that they are important women, both historically and mythologically. You have Theodora, right, Empress of the Byzantine era, Virginia Woolf, of course, a famous writer, Georgia O'Keeffe, famous painter. We haven't looked at her works, but you can go Google them. Sojourner Truth, Artemisia Gentileschi, we've seen her, right? And notice that each of the plates and the embroideries, right, it all fits with kind of the characteristic of the person. I love how Artemisia's A is like a little palette with a brush and like a little palette tool. It's very nice. So the plates kind of reflect the person. The embroidery reflects the person. Hildegard of Bingen from the medieval age, her plate kind of looks like a stained glass window. Theodora's looks like a mosaic. So this is a really famous project. And again, now today has the home it so deserves, right, at the Brooklyn Art Museum. And as I mentioned, mythological figures as well, right? Snake goddess from Aegean mythology, Kali from Indian belief. So she plays with real and unreal people.